Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to our YouTube channel. This is John from Programming Knowledge. And in this tutorial guys, I want to talk to you guys about variables in C. Now, when we're using C programming language, a lot of times we're going to be dealing with data. So there's going to be different data values or different information that we're going to want to keep track and use inside of our programs. And sometimes it can be difficult to maintain and keep track of all that data, and that's where variables come in. So basically, variable is essentially a container where we can store different pieces of information. So different data values, we could sort of things like numbers or text or characters, and these variables make it a lot easier for us to keep track and manage all the data in our C program. So I'm going to show you guys basically how variables work, or how variables can be useful and how we can use them in our C programs. But down here I have a very basic program. So I'm basically just printing out a little story. So it says there once was a man named Mike. He was 50 years old. He really liked the name Mike but did not like being 50. So this is a simple program. We're just printing out a bunch of different lines of text, and then when I run this program, you'll see we print out the actual story. So over here we have the actual story, and this is great. Okay, but let's say that I'm reading through my story and I'm reading through my program, and I'm thinking to myself, I think I want to change the character's name. So instead of calling the character Mike, why don't we call him like John in order to make that change? So I'm gonna have to look through my entire program and find every place where we mention the character's name. So right here is one, so change it to John. And remember, keep looking here, and there's another one. So we'll change this to John, right? So I had to manually go through and change every instance of the character's name to John. So let's say that's okay. That sounds pretty good. But maybe I'm thinking I want to make the character a little bit younger. So instead of like 50 years old, so let's change it to maybe 30 years old instead of 50 years old. Okay, we're going to change here. He was 30 years old, and also in here, the last line of our story. So that's 30 instead of 50. If I was to run this program, then all that information will be updated and we'll now have new story. Okay, so here's the problem though. I'm dealing with a very short story, so I mean this is 4 lines. We only mention the character's age and name only twice. But imagine if I was writing out a huge C program that had hundreds of lines in the story. So story had hundreds of lines, and maybe we mention the character's name hundreds of times. They mention their age hundreds of times, and if we wanted to change the character's age or name, I would have to go through and manually change it every single location, and that would take forever, and it would be a huge drag for us to change all the instances of the name of our character, and also for our for the age of our character. So basically that's not a good way for us to manage and maintain the data for our programs. Okay, basically we have two pieces of data that we're working with, and consistently in this program, the character's age and the character's name. What I want to show you guys now is how we can use variables to better keep track, manage these pieces of information. So remember, a variable is basically just a container where we can store some data. So I want to create two variables which will store the character's name and the character's age. And I'll show you guys how this can make our program a lot easier to manage. Up here, before the print statement, I'm just going to make a new line, and I'm gonna come over here and I want to create a variable. Now, whenever we create a variable in C, we have to give C a couple pieces of information. The first thing we have to tell C is that what type of information we want this variable to store. Now, I'm going to get into the different data types that we can represent and see more in the next tutorial. But for now, just know that there's a bunch of different types of data that we can store, and we can store things like numbers, characters, we can store text, we can store decimal numbers, all sorts of stuff like that. In our case, I'm going to store the character's name and the character's age. Basically just a collection of characters. So in order to create this variable, the first thing that I have to tell C that I want to create a variable that's gonna store some characters, and to do that I'm just gonna type out char here just like that, and basically telling C we're gonna store characters inside of this variable. So after we type out char, I wanted to type the name of the variable that I want to create. Remember that a variable is a container, and it's a good idea for us to give these containers descriptive names, and those names will basically let us know what that variable is storing inside of it. So I'm going to call this character name. Now what I want to do is basically I want to store multiple characters. So over here we're telling C that I want to store a character, but in C we can also store, instead of just storing like one single character, we can store a bunch of characters, and that would be kind of like, you know, a name. So there's like 4 characters in here. So in order for us to store a bunch of characters inside of this particular variable, after we type the character variable name, we're gonna have to make an open and close square brackets, and that's gonna tell C that we want to store a bunch of characters inside of this particular variable. So char character name, open and close square brackets. I'm gonna set this equal to something. So I am essentially assigning a value to this particular variable, and I'm just gonna make an open close quotation marks. So equals and then quotation marks, and inside of here we're gonna type out the value that we want to store. So in my case, I'm just gonna store the character's name, which is John, and then as always in C, we're gonna have to end this off with a semicolon. So alright, basically what I did here was I created a variable, and I told C that I want to store in the variable, I wanted to store a character, and I give this variable a name, character name, and then I use this open and close square brackets to tell C that I wanted to store a bunch of characters, not just one. Now what we can do is we can make another variable to store the character's age. So in this case, we're gonna do something similar, but we're gonna want to store a number. And there's a bunch of different ways that we can store numbers in C, but for our purposes, we're storing age. So we're gonna use something called an integer, and an integer is basically just a whole number. So I'm just gonna type out int here, int, and that basically stands for integer. And now we're gonna give this name. So I'm gonna call this character age, and I'm gonna set this equal to a number. So in our story, the age is 35. So I'm just gonna type out 35 there, and now we can again end this off with a semicolon. So I have here 2 variables, this one storing the character name, and this one is for our age. Now the question becomes how we can use this inside our program. Well, basically what we can do is we can print them out alongside with this text, and we can actually use this printf function in order to do that. So I'm gonna show you guys how to do this, and then we're gonna talk about it. So basically I'm gonna go over here And as you can see, we have here the character name, which is John. Okay, so we can replace this with %s. So %s is basically a placeholder. So after this, we're going to add comma here, and then we're gonna add the character name variable. So basically, we're telling C that we're going to print this particular text, and %s is just a placeholder that will automatically be replaced by the value of our variable character name. So we have the first instance of the character name, and then right here we also need to replace this with %s, and then add comma, and then character name, because we want to replace that with our value of our variable character name, which is John. And of course, like here, we also need to replace this with the actual value of our character age. So what we can do here is just we can add %d. So %d is also a placeholder for printing the integer. Uh, so this is like integer. Integer character age equals 35, and then %d, and then we're gonna add comma here. So, and then character age. The same thing here, character age, and then we're going to replace this with %d, a placeholder for integer. So if we try to run our program, so let's do that, build and run, and we should have the so we have a process return. So I think we have something, or we have an error with our program. So let's try to debug this. So warning, format S expects per argument type of character, but argument 2 has type int. That's basically because we didn't add the uh, square brackets there. So build and run. So there you go. We have now the output. There once was a man named John. He was 35 years old. He really liked the name John, but did not like being 35. And of course, every time you can, if you want to change something with this story, so for example, instead of John, we will say Michael, and we can change also the age, like 40, and then um, exit that, and then build and run. So as you can see here, we now have the updated story. So Michael, and then 40 years old. So the good thing about variable is that we can reuse this into our entire program. So we have every time we have changes here, all the variables or all the value should be reflected in our the rest on our program. So in our case, we have updated all the values for our story. Okay, so I think that's it for this tutorial, guys, and in the next video we're going to continue working on with variables, because there's a lot to discuss with variables, and it is just the beginning. So see you in the next video.